you for joining. Jump right in. Is that this presentation is designed to be useful for all all participants. In other words, it's not tied to any one version of X3, and it's not tied to any proficiency level. Okay, so it's going to be a useful guide regardless of your circumstance or situation. But not everything we cover today is going to apply to all users as well. I just want to make sure that that's clear. So if I talk about subcontracting, for example, you guys don't do that, that's okay. You can just ignore me for that part. All right, so for the agenda, we're going to be covering these things you see on the slide here. We're going to cover your year-end checklist, and these are kind of your tasks to perform before closing. We're also going to cover your managerial reports for tying out your GL. And when it comes to closing your fiscal year, there really isn't too much difference from closing the period. So you got that, will be useful for you if you closed months previously. And a couple things to consider regarding things that you're going to want to consider before you close. You're going to want to run your financial data extraction, or SEI, just to ensure that everything ties out. And some other considerations are related to sort of annual maintenance type of activities that you're going to want to do at year end. And we'll get into those in detail later in the presentation. We're also going to cover 1099s, the generation and reporting, and we'll discuss kind of updating your default parameters. Okay, that's default start date on reports, for example, and then we'll have our Q&A session. All right. So jumping right into the checklist, and we're going to cover a couple different areas here. The first is kind of your operational transactions, those being your stock movements, et cetera. Then we're going to talk a little bit about our financial transactions. And the kind of common theme to what we're going to be going over today is that we're going to be going to ensure that all of our processes have been completed, which in X3 speak just means that we're going to be finalizing, validating, and posting the transactions. Doing so is not only required to ensure that your books are correct, but it's also required before X3 will allow you to close the period and year. So, if you had various transactions or transactions that are in a semi-complete state, for example, that's going to be something that's going to prevent X3 from actually closing. For example, a journal entry that's in a temporary status would need to be changed to final. Okay. So getting into some of the particulars of closing here, you're going to want to ensure that your receipts and deliveries have been validated and invoiced. And which, if this is something you've done for a long time, you'll know it's just a normal kind of monthly process for closing. You're also going to want to ensure your sales invoices and credit memos are posted. And you can see we've listed the functions on the screen here for you on the slide, should those be useful to you. And same is true for your purchase invoices and credit memos. Okay, you're going to make sure that those are posted. A couple of things to note, though, when we're talking about finalizing and posting your transactions, there are a few different ways that you can go about making sure that transactions are finalized. In other words, that there aren't any unposted. Okay. And if you aren't posting in real time, the most efficient way to capture unposted entries is to run a function in the relevant modules that will allow you to post either many transactions or all of them at once. So for example, under sales invoices, there's a credit memo validation button, and that means posting. And they'll have a little pop-up screen that'll let you choose various criteria. Okay. For example, you can do maybe all users or just a specific user, or you could do it one site at a time or by a document range. Of course, you could just leave the filter wide open, and it'll just post everything at once. And you can use any kind of combination of those filters I've described. Another way that you can find unposted transactions is to use the advanced selection feature in the various functions in X3. Then you just make sure that you're looking for unposted or unvalidated or whatever's appropriate for what you're trying to find. And this method really allows you to review the entries before posting them. So that's helpful. In addition to that, when you're in your transactions to begin with, you may just post them one by one in real time as you go through. So you can certainly do that if it's a process that feels comfortable to you. Okay. The next thing that you're going to want to concern yourself with is making sure that your payments are posted. So both your payments and your deposits, make sure those are completed. Next, you're going to want to execute the dimensional balance recovery function. And this is one of those things that periodically is good to do, especially if you're kind of new to X3, because what can potentially happen is that there are tables that can get out of sync in X3, which it doesn't happen often. But since the potential exists for it to happen, you should run this utility at year end. And it's located under Financials, Utilities. It's called Dimensional Balances QTY. And what it does is it just resyncs those tables and makes sure that the dimension balances tie to your GL. If you run it and you didn't need to, it's not a problem, no harm done. And for those of you who aren't using dimensions at all, this is one of those that doesn't apply to you. Okay, the next step, you'll want to make sure that you've done your physical inventory, everybody's favorite exercise, and make sure that that in X3 they're complete and you've closed out all your stock count sessions. That way the journals are ready to post once your stock accounting interface runs. If that isn't completed, it can cause issues. So, okay, moving to the next step. For those of you who do subcontracting, you want to make sure that your costs are calculated and posted. Looking at the stock accounting interface in more detail, you want to ensure that that posted with no errors. Some of you may have those as recurring tasks, and hopefully you're familiar with recurring tasks, but basically those are tasks that can be automated within X3. For the stock accounting interface, for example, they can run every hour, every day, or however you've set yours to run. But many of you may not really think about these too often, simply because they do or can run in the background, but for year end, it's good to run them manually. And the functions are listed on the screen for you. What these will do, in the event that any transactions are stuck and error out, that you don't see from your automatic process, there will be a log of errors that'll read out, and it'll reveal any transactions that you need to address before you attempt to close. Okay. And then you'll also want to run your WIP accounting interface and make sure that it posts with no errors. All right. Moving on to the checklist. And that was kind of the operational tasks, and now we're going to cover some of the financial tasks and transactions. So what we're going to want to start with here is to enter your accrual entries as well as generate their reversals. As many of you know, reversals are things that you can generate one at a time, or if you go under Financials, Current Processes, there is a function that will reverse all those en masse. Now you're going to want to generate all of your recurring entries. And again, there's a function for that as well. And for depreciation, assuming you're not running a recurring task or that you aren't using fixed assets, you'll want to ensure to make your depreciation entries as well. Okay. You're also going to want to confirm all your intercompany account balances, making sure your due tos match your due froms between all of your companies. You'll then need to check your variances and your variance accounts, your clearing accounts, your R&I, your S&I, and your 999s, which would just be the suspense account. And when you review these accounts, you just want to verify that they make sense, and to the extent that's necessary, you should ensure that you have those cleaned up via journal entries. And if something seems out of whack or not quite right, especially if things are hitting the 999 account, you should probably make a note of that, because there's likely an accounting code in the background in X3 that can be updated that will prevent that from hitting that account in the future. Using the 999 account in the normal fashion, that's kind of your catch-all, where the transactions that don't have a known home, they end up in that suspense account. Okay. The next step would be to run your invoices to receive process. So you manage stock from a PO to post to the expense and the R&I account properly. But for your non-inventory items, there's no entry for the receipt of those. So if you've not received the invoice, you'll need to accrue for those, okay? So to help you in that effort, you can run a process under Financials, Closing Procedures, Invoice Receivables function. And that's going to be a small dialog box for you to make some criteria selections. And you want to make sure that over on the right, and you'll see there's a non-manage button, you'll need to check that. In addition, you can reverse that if you want to, and there's a reversal date in the bottom right corner for that as well. Okay, on to our next step, match R&I account. So you're going to want to go through the automatic and manual matching, run that process, and then you're going to dump that out into Excel, which you can use as your backup for your R&I balance. Okay. Next, you'll want to generate your multi-currency revaluation entries. That's for any invoices that are sitting out there that are in different currencies. Okay, so you'll just do the translation at that time. Okay, now we'll delve into dimensions for a few minutes here, because you may want to consider any dimensional allocations. And what some people do is come year end, they're going to do a download of maybe a trial balance by dimension. And they're just going to make sure all the rules that are meant to be followed are followed. For example, make sure all of your expense accounts have a department, and make sure nothing was entered incorrectly. And even if you have controls in place, it's a good exercise to confirm dimensional balances, because there are ways that users can put data in where it may not have populated those fields. And a couple notes on this. You can change any aspect of the journal, including dimensions, while in temporary status. Okay. There's also a parameter that exists that allows you to change dimensions after journals are finalized. But some clients, they choose not to enable that because there isn't an audit trail tied to it. But what you cannot change are the posting dates, the GL accounts, and the amounts. Okay, this is only specific to the dimensions themselves. So next, you'll take any of your simulated journal entries that exist and clean those up. You either delete them or make them actual. So X3 won't let you go forward if you have any simulated entries that are sitting out there. Okay. All right, fixed assets. For those of you using fixed assets module, there are a couple of things to consider. You want to confirm that all your periods are set to actual and not simulated on the depreciation context screen. The default is set to simulated, so you want to be careful to check that. You'll also want to confirm that all your journals are posted for the year. Okay. You'll want to check the context monitor and make sure that it's green rather than red, because if it is red, that indicates that there's an issue that would need to be addressed. And an example of that would be, if you disposed of an asset and didn't post that entry, you'd need to do that before you'd be able to move forward. But once you're confident that your fixed assets are correct, they've made it to your GL as they should and no longer in simulated, and all is well with that, you'll then go ahead and close your fixed asset module. But a word of warning here, okay? Be careful, because fixed assets is its own separate module, which is kind of a unique thing in X3. So once it is closed, you can't reopen it again. So you just want to make doubly sure that it's correct before you do close it. You also need to ensure that fixed assets is closed before you can close your GL. Okay. Moving forward, you're going to need to reconcile your bank accounts, of course, making sure that your cash accounts are tied out to the bank and that everything is flowing smoothly from that aspect. All right. Okay. On this slide, we're showing you some options that are available within the close process, not only to help keep things organized, but I guess to help restrict users from making some entries that'll foul you up when you try to close. Because what you may find happens, and I'm guessing you probably have a system where there are numerous people who have access to it. It's not just you working in there. But you yourself may have gone ahead and dealt with a department from a period or year-end closing perspective, thinking that it's done or ready for closing, only to find out that somebody had posted maybe a purchase invoice to the wrong date, maybe having backdated it after you had already kind of prepped it and considered it ready for closing or closed. The good news is there's some parameters that exist within X3, and they can help to prevent that from happening. And these are up on the slide here. Okay. So you want to go to Setup, General Parameters, Parameter Values, and you'll want to select Chapter TC, so you can see on the slide, and the group is CLO. And on the PowerPoint here, the parameter values with numerous X's in them. The X's are just placeholders because those can be both a start date and an end date, usually indicated by END or STR. Okay. So your purchase invoices are the ACH, journal and batch entries are the CPT, etc. So using that, that's one way that you can sort of pre-lock down your system when you haven't yet closed it and you don't want people to post to it. Okay. A couple of other tools that you can employ would be that you can restrict certain postings by document type by going to Setup, Financials, Document Types, and in there, there's a validity date that you can select. So you can set that for January 1st, 2020, should you so choose. That's another way. Additionally, there's a way through the use of the journal code where you can deactivate those, or there's an access code in there as well. Okay, so you can use that. So that's a couple ways to restrict entries, but of course, you could just run your GL detail reports and look for anything that has an entered date later than when you cleared, quote unquote, those areas for closing. But the out-of-the-box Crystal report for your GL detail in X3 doesn't have the entered dates or even the user for that matter. So why would it be useful in this case? But those fields can be added relatively easily in X3. So if you guys don't have those and think that they'd be useful to you, and you're not terribly savvy in Crystal, you can certainly reach out to us at RKL. It isn't very time consuming and we can make those changes fairly easily. People really do find them useful, kind of knowing who did what and when helps a lot. Okay. Moving on. So managerial reports. There are some report codes on the screen here. And if you need help finding them in X3, you can go to Reports, 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 and search on NA-BPATB. That would be for your customer aging as well as your supplier aging. So you're going to want to run those. And just a note, they do use the same code, but there's a parameter that you select on that specific report where you select whether it's a customer or a supplier. And then you also want to run your trial balance. And in V12, version 12 for any of you on V12, there are some changes to the report codes, I believe. So if you have any trouble finding them, of course, just let us know. We're always happy to help. And matching detail for R&I accounts. Okay, so this is one where we've made some enhancements that are available to you should you want them. We have a requester that exists for your matching detail for R&I accounts. It's called ACH040. If you can see that on the slide. And depending on when and who did your implementation, you may have that available to you already. If not, just reach out to one of your consultants and we can certainly add that to your system. Again, it's not something that is time consuming to implement for you, and it is helpful. So it does have some limitations though, but as long as you're not doing partial receipts, it's going to help you tie out. So as long as you receive an invoice in full, this requester will work. Okay. So there's also a fixed asset listing. And again, RKL has a report that a lot of our clients do find a little bit more useful than the out-of-the-box one. Okay. It has, the reason why is because it has your book value on there, your asset total, accumulated depreciation total, your net book value, and all of that ties to the trial balance. So if that's something that sounds useful to you, again, another one you can just reach out to us and we'll help you out. And the next one is your stock valuation report. And this is one that you want to run pretty much right when the ball drops at New Year's, assuming that's your fiscal year end, of course. There's a recurring task that can be set up for you as well. So, you know, you have a stock valuation report that can run at, you know, say 12:01 on January 1st. So that can be very useful. Next is the ZWIP requester. And again, this is another RKL tool designed to make the process a bit easier for you. This could be a requester that's already on your system, but if not, definitely reach out to us and we'll help you with it as well. But it provides the work order detail of what's in the WIP account that ties to the WIP on your GL. And just a note, this is really a reconciliation report. It's not set up to be an inventory report, just to clarify that. But reach out if those things sound useful to you. Okay, moving on, closing your year. So now that all the kind of pre-work has been done, and we're saying goodbye to 2019, we're going to get into the actual exercise of closing the period and year. There's a few final reports or things that you need to execute beforehand in order to close your period. So to close the period, you're going to need to run a final validation for all of your temporary entries for 2019. And again, that functions up on the screen for you. You can see it there. You're also going to want to review your pre-closing report. Okay. And for those of you who aren't familiar with that report, that's your CLOPER report, or CLOPER. And if you're not running that on a monthly basis, it's something that's useful. Okay. And basically what it does is, if you go to close the period, any errors that would show up when you close the period would just show up on the CLOPER report. So it's basically just a preview of any issues that you would need to take care of before closing. Okay, next you're going to want to close your stock period. And from there, when that's done, you'll actually close the period. Before you do that, though, to avoid problems later, you'll want to make sure that the year 2020 is open, okay? And that at least the first period is open, so January 2020 in this case. Though most people will tend to open other months as well, but you definitely want need the first period open. And when you do close the period, being that it is the final period in the year, X3 is going to prompt you to tell you that it's the final period of the year. So just make note of that. All right. So when it's finally time to execute closing your year, there's a couple of things that you want to make sure of, okay? And these are things you'd probably do for month end that you'd want to follow as well. But certainly during year end, you'll need to ensure that all your users are logged out of X3, and you'll need to turn off your accounting tasks, okay? And then there are a couple of things to check that should be in place, but it's probably good practice just to double check them anyway. One of them is that you're going to want to make sure that you have the NEWPR journal and document type created. And those should exist unless you have an older system, in which case I believe you'd have to add those in there, but it's worth checking. If they're in there, great, you're good to go. You'll also want to check the parameters for both your analytical and your general ledger carry forward to make sure that those are set to yes. Okay. And on the slide, we've listed the codes for the parameters there. You can see that. Another thing that you'll want to do is make sure that on your chart of accounts, you also want to check out your miscellaneous accounts tab to make sure and again, this is probably applies to people closing their year for the first time, but make sure that your line 11 is your retained earnings accounts. And in addition to that, you just want to make sure that all your other lines have values in them, as you may run into errors if they don't. Okay. Okay, so now we're getting into how we actually, execute closing the year and doing the year-end close. So you're going to go to Financial, Closing Process, Fiscal Year Close. From there, you're going to get this pop-up screen that you can see on the slide here. And make sure that you have the correct company selected. Make sure that all ledgers are set to no. And just to note, you're just going to close your legal ledger for now. And this new fiscal year will be fiscal year 2020, obviously. And then you'll want to tab through and make sure that those NEWPRs I previously mentioned are present, which you can see. And you may want to run the simulation, which we'll talk about in a minute. And once you run this process for real, there's going to be two journals that are created. So one is going to roll your current year and your retained earnings, and the next is going to carry forward your GL balances. Okay. And one thing to do as well is to ensure that everything is the way that you want it to be within the account class function. That's where the carry forward is defined. And that's an area where, depending on how granular you are, and at the least granular level, you're going to have any account that starts with a 1 as your asset. And within that accounting class function, you want to ensure that the carry forward is selected or set to yes. Okay. And dimensions have a similar thing that's handled at the dimension type for which ones to carry forward. So if you've done that before and your dimensions got goofed up or something like that, that might just be something that you need to check or have your X3 consultant get on a meeting with them and look at it together to make sure that everything seems correct. Okay, so getting into the simulation, and we'll just talk about what that means for a second. So if you aren't ready to close the year and you want to have a lot of your reports populated correctly, which I'm sure you do, you at least need to run the simulation. And that will just carry forward a simulated entry that a lot of the out-of-the-box reports from Sage are set to pick up. So the trial balance, for example, things like that. So that's one option that people often do. And another thing as well is when these journals do post, and like I said, there's two different entries, one to close everything out and one to carry things forward. Okay, it's advised that you leave the carry forward one in 2020 set to temporary status, which will just make your life easier should you need to, reopen the period. All right. And for financial reporting considerations, you're going to want to verify your trial balances using a financial data extractor or SEI, and verify your balances to make sure that everything is as you expect it to be. You're going to confirm that your roll forward of your ending balance and beginning balances are looking correct. And there are a couple ways to get the data, and assuming that most people have a reporting tool like SEI, you'd use that as the preferred method. Otherwise, you can just use the financial data extraction. Okay. Moving on, there are some other considerations that you want to take into account. And most of this is really just maintenance. And theoretically, at this point, we have a closed year. So in terms of your budget, and if you guys do use the budgeting features in X3, in this new year, you can create new budget codes, should you want to, or you can import into existing codes. You could also create a new version of the budget. If you do use your same budget codes, though, then your SEI reports will still work and no changes will be necessary. So that's what we would probably recommend that you do. But again, it would be based on your specific needs, and that's something you could discuss with your X3 consultant should you desire that. And as for operational budgets, if you do use those, you're going to need to calculate those so that you can carry them forward into 2020 where that's appropriate. Okay. All right. Regarding the sales and purchasing price lists, if you use those, now is a great time of year to update them. But a couple of things to consider on that. So depending on how you set those up when you originally put them in, some people set the validity date to end at year end if you're expecting new pricing. So if that's the case, just make sure you don't have a lag there of a period without a price list in it. And a good practice would be to have that date set out in the future, just so that you have something in place and until you do get the updated price in there. Okay, but that's something that you can do via an import, both on the purchasing and the sales price list perspective. All right. Next, we're going to talk about standard costs. So If you leave everything as is, the system is going to use 2019 standard costs until you create the 2020 list. Walking through what we find to be the best practice here for creating your new standard costs for the next year. And what you're going to want to do is to copy your current raw material standard costs into the 2020 simulated. Okay. Then you can export that out into Excel where you'll make any appropriate changes. And if you're going to be changing your standards, then you just re-import that back into simulated. Okay. So next, you're going to do a 2020 BOM rollup, okay, which you can then validate, and you can take that simulated 2020 standard cost value, and you can promote those up to your actual standard costs. And that's really the most straightforward way that we've found to update your standard costs. And again, this is an area where, of course, RKL can help you if you feel like you need some support. So do feel free to reach out to us. All right. Okay, so we're getting close to the end of the presentation. We still want to talk about a few things, 1099s, for example. And 1099 functionality is found in X3 under declarations. So you want to go to fee declarations, then 1099 generation. And remember, you had to set up your supplier as 1099. Or depending on your version of X3, it could be called DAS, which for anyone who doesn't know, it's just the European equivalent of our 1099. So just be sure you know that that box needed to be checked ahead of time. But if not, don't worry. All hope is not lost. If you do find yourself in that situation, just reach out to your RKL X3 solution architect, and we'll be able to help you out. Okay. There's a payment summary within this function that's going to allow you to edit various invoices or change the amounts. So there's a place where you can change what the 1099 amount is for various invoices. And you can make edits to what you originally put in there should you need to. So after you do that and confirm that things are correct, you'll then want to run the calculate 1099 payments function. And just a note here, and should you so need to, and because there isn't a form in X3 that I'm aware of, there are forms that you can purchase at any office supply store for this, where you just, you put that in your printer and print from there. If it did come out misaligned or something wasn't right, you can have some simple edits made in Crystal Reports to get things printing properly. Again, this is another area where RKL can certainly help you with that if you need it. Okay. But also regarding electronic filing, there isn't any electronic filing within X3. However, you can buy third-party products that will help you with that. And so some of you might have requirements to file electronically. So if you need more information on that, feel free to let us know and we can help you out for any electronic filing needs that you may have. Okay. Okay, default date parameters. One last thing that we want to talk about here, come year end, there are some areas in X3 that use default date parameters. And to clarify, these are the default dates that populate within X3 when you run a report or view an inquiry. So these are found in the SUP supervisor chapter, and the group is DEF, and you can see that on the slide here. And this is where you can put in your various start and end dates to populate your dates for 2020. So it's a good thing to set. A word of caution on this screen, though. You need to make sure that the ENDDAT field, NDAT, on line 6, you're going to want to make sure that this date is set at least 1 year out into the future. Because this is basically when X3 is going to actually stop letting you post transactions. So it's very important that you have that straight so that you don't run into posting issues a year from now. And this is just one of those unfortunate buttons that, if not set correctly, it can cause you a lot of heartache if you don't catch it. So definitely something to check early in your last period to make sure that you won't be negatively affected by any incorrect value. And there really wouldn't be much harm setting this even a few years into the future. And how far out to set it is really just a matter of opinion. You could even go 5 years out, but that's up to you. Okay, so that's default date parameters. And we've reached the conclusion of the slide, but before I end, I'd just like to say a few last things. One is that your fiscal year doesn't need to be closed immediately, okay? Most people will tend to leave these open until after their audit is completed, but it really is just up to you and your business how you proceed with closing. And again, they can be reopened without too much heartache, but they may be left open for a couple months or however long is really deemed appropriate for you. The other thing is that if you do run that simulated year end, at the very least, that updates your beginning balances for your reports. And you just need to ensure that you have the FYE fiscal year end flag included for your analysis purposes. So that does conclude the presentation. I want to thank everyone for joining. And at this point, I will turn it back to Danica.